Bom dia. Primeiro, agradeço muito o convite. De verdade, sinto-me honrada, porque é o meu primeiro seminário que estou dando para um instituto brasileiro. Alegro-me muito. Eu falo português, não tão bem, mas falo, entendo bem, eh, mas por isso, sem muita prática, recentemente vou falar inglês. Então, vou continuar agora falando inglês, com a minha apresentação. Well, I will begin my presentation. So basically, I will focus on two aspects in my presentation. I will begin by looking at the current power structure in the international politics and how I see the evolution of this power structure in the past 15 years, including the growing role and growing influence of the Global South. And then I will go on discussing the potential for the Global South to shape this emerging global order, but also limitations that countries of the Global South have. And since I'm doing for an institute in Latin America, and also, as Susanna has said, one of my regional focuses is Latin America. I will pay particular attention to Latin America, to the region Latin America and Caribbean in the second part of my presentation. So what we are observing today in international politics is that it is undergoing a period of fundamental shifts. I mean, we all know it. And these shifts are changing the way that international actors like states, but also other actors interact with each other, both bilaterally and multilaterally. And as a process of restructuring the post-1945 global order is ongoing. Now, it is far from concluded. It is impossible to provide a definitive overview. So what I will do today is to capture the moment, we're currently in, because we cannot predict with certainty what will happen in the next 20 years, other than a lot will change. So everything is very fluid. That's to begin with. And looking back, at the turn of the century, there were still several international relations scholars and also policymakers who were still convinced that while there were new players emerging, especially in East Asia, the US global power remained largely unchallenged. Even in 2005, Richard Haas, for example, he said that US global power US still was major global power. But I want to focus on the year 2008, that from my perspective marked an important turning point. I'm sure we can discuss it later, and you can debate about the turning points that we have been through in the last 20 years. But I took this year for two reasons. First, the global financial crisis significantly damaged the strengths, but also the reputation, the reliability of the Western economies, while China and other Asian economies recovered much faster. And this faster recovery highlighted their resilience and growing influence. And that was precisely the moment when scholars and policymakers started to speak about the Asian century. By the way, also Latin American economies recovered faster than the advanced economies in European Union or the United States. So, and the second reason is geopolitical tensions between the East, Russia, and the West, US, EU, that also started to rise this year, in 2008. Why? Well, first, Kosovo, it was the year when Kosovo declared its independence from Serbia. And this step was backed by United States and by most members of the European Union. However, Russia saw it as a violation, violation of international norms and of territorial integrity. Later, the same year, at the NATO Bucharest summit, Georgia and Ukraine were promised NATO membership, which was seen as a red line, as a total red line, as a no-go by Russia. So the rift between East and West now gets bigger. And in August 2008, a war broke out between Georgia and Russia over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This war lasted only several days, like 5 days, but it had long-term geopolitical consequences because it exacerbated the geopolitical conflict between Russia and the West. And 10 years later, so in 2018, the world, I would say the world appeared to be divided into two rival blocs, the West and the East. As you know, in 2014, there was a political upheaval in Ukraine, in Kiev, and with Russia's subsequent annexation of Crimea. And in 2018, the trade war between US and China erupted. And so, yeah, the paradigm of a new Cold War gained new momentum. Now, the Cold War between East and West. But couple of years later, another turning point happened, and I'm talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. Why? Because I would say that this pandemic showcased the growing role of the Global South. Yes, Europe and the US and United States led the way in vaccine production, and they were initially reluctant to share their vaccines. So and this reluctance prompted countries in the Global South, at that time, India, for example, India and South Africa, to elaborate counter strategies. For example, to propose a temporary waiver of TRIPS waiver of certain provisions of the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And it was a landmark initiative that received broad support from developing economies in the Global South, and it highlighted the growing leadership of the Global South in global governance, particularly, especially with regard to health equity and intellectual property rights. Also, many Global South leaders, like, for example, Agnes Binawaho, former Rwandan health minister, became global voices for justice, for vaccine justice, as wealthy nations were showing very egocentric, selfish behavior and hoarding doses. Now, her famous statement towards the EU, "Be frank and say, my people first. Don't lie to me and say we will be equal." So the truth emerged. And most recently, the influence of the Global South became even more visible after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Indonesia, Brazil, together with China and several African states, launched or proposed peace initiatives to end the war in Europe for the first time in history. I mean, historically in past decades or even centuries, it has been exactly the opposite way. The Western nations, Europeans, came to the Global South and were teaching how to resolve conflicts or how to live. And this time, for the first time, the tables have started to turn. So where are we today? I would say, now that's how I see it, that we are today still in a transitional phase, in the transitional period of reshaping of the global order. That means we can see broader contours, but the structural foundations, now the complete structure, is still taking shape. It is still evolving. What we can say is that the world today is neither unipolar nor bipolar. It is increasingly multipolar. And I would Yeah, I would say there are at least three big poles. I call the West, now led by United States and European Union, and despite internal disagreements and transatlantic rifts that exist, this bloc remains an important economic and political actor. Then the second, the East, led by Russia and China, that has asserted, the East has asserted itself through declared no-limit strategic partnership. We all know that there are also that this partnership is not easy. There are also elements of competition in this partnership. Still, already more than 90% of bilateral trade between Russia and China is being conducted in local currencies, in Chinese yuan and Russian rubles. And with this, we see an effort to reduce the dominance of US dollar and in international trade, and to challenge Western financial dominance. And finally, the third bloc, the biggest bloc, the rising global south. It is less cohesive, I would say, than the other two. So it's not a cohesive, it is not even a bloc, but it's a diverse set of countries that are currently gaining economic and political weight. And I'm speaking, of course, of regional powers like India, like Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, or Saudi Arabia, that are increasingly shaping global debates. And Global South is still underrepresented in global governance institutions such as UN Security Council. However, its influence is growing. Now, for example, today it accounts for more than 80% of global population and contributes nearly 60% of global GDP, measured by purchasing power parity. And by 2050, its share of world GDP is expected to rise to even 72%. So, as I said, there are three big poles: the East, the West, and the Global South. But the relationship between these poles and among them are not clearly defined. For instance, relations between US and United States and European Union have fractured, while Washington and Moscow have initiated an attempt at rapprochement. But it has not really progressed yet, but still they have started it. And the relationship between US and China fluctuates. On the one side, we have escalating rhetoric, political tensions. On the other side, there are attempts for diplomatic engagement. When talking about the multilateral level, it is even more interesting. For example, more than 100 countries are participating in China's Belt and Road Initiative. 100 countries from all three poles, from the East, from the West, and from Global South. They are all united in this Chinese initiative. Now, there are more than 50 countries from Africa, several Asian nations, over 20 countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, and also 17 countries participating from the European Union. So what we can say is that in this emerging global order, partnerships and alliances are increasingly shaped by strategic interests rather than by shared values. Surely it is debatable, but that's what I can see, this a tendency that I can, that I perceive. And this shift reflects a pragmatic recalibration of international relations, where states prioritize economic, strategic, geopolitical considerations over ideological alignment. And I would say that in the current climate of uncertainty and unpredictability, so this kind of interest-driven diplomacy offers more flexibility and also space for compromise in order to control the tensions and the escalations, because we will see more, unfortunately, most probably we will see more conflicts emerging in the future. That always happens in times of transition and in times of transformations, when old ways don't work anymore, but new ways have not been fully developed yet. And this trend, this trend of interest-driven partnerships and alliances, diplomacy, is spearheaded by the Global South countries, because their foreign policies are being guided by strategic autonomy, increasingly being guided by strategic autonomy, balancing, and multi-alignment. So that was already basically one of the potentials that I see for Global South in this emerging global order. Prioritize, so be pragmatic and be realist, be pragmatic, more interest-driven than ideology-driven. And now I'm entering the second part of my presentation, Global South and the emerging global order. So where do I see a potential? Now, where do I see a potential for Global South to shape it? And of course, you can find more aspects, more elements, but I will focus on two that I consider important. First is acting as neutral parties and as mediators. Now, I'm referring to the so-called middle powers, because due to their political ambitions and strategic flexibility, they have the potential to play a moderating role in the emerging global order. Just a couple of recent examples. Like a couple of weeks, or last week or 2 weeks ago, there were bilateral talks held in Abu Dhabi between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for the first time in the capital of United Arab Emirates, without traditional mediators from the West or the East, like Russia or United States or Brussels. But the United Arab Emirates has brokered various prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine so far. Qatar has mediated has helped to mediate to bring back Ukrainian children from Russia. Brazil has been actively involved in mediating between Guyana and Venezuela regarding the border dispute. So the global political and diplomatic influence of emerging middle powers, mainly in the Global South, is growing, and they are establishing themselves as neutral platforms for conflict resolution. I think it's important because their diplomatic style is currently more pragmatic. I would say more pragmatic than the diplomatic style in some Western countries, inside European Union, for example. The second aspect I want to highlight is changing established rules of the game. I'm referring to the BRICS. I mean, the BRICS unites countries that are very diverse, and there are internal disagreements between this. Now there are more or less 20, I think 20 countries, the permanent members and partner countries. So we have like more than 20 countries that are integrating the group. So despite these internal differences and different identities also, all BRICS member states and partner countries largely agree that there is need to develop new payment systems or new payment platforms to reduce the dependence on the US dollar. I'm not talking about creating new currency, BRICS currency. It will not happen in the foreseeable future. But I'm talking is that, for example, India already pays for Russian oil in local currencies, in rupee, but also in Chinese yuan or in Arab dirham. Russia and Ethiopia are considering trading in their local currencies. And the BRICS Development Bank says in its strategy until 2026 that it intends to provide around 30% of its financing in local currencies as well. And regarding the latest BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro, both its composition and the final communique, in my view, underscore the growing importance of the Global South for the future direction of the BRICS. So that the Global South members will gain more influence inside the bloc, even more than Russia and China in the longer run, I would say. And the Rio Declaration clearly emphasizes the role of the Global South as a driving force for a positive change in the world. Well, it is easier said than done. Let's be honest. It is far more complicated to arrive there. Why? Because there are multiple challenges. The first one, well, there are more. I just picked out some that I consider probably the central, the most important ones, but there are more challenges, unfortunately. And for example, political fragmentation. There is no unified political voice within the Global South. And there are also intra-South inequality, meaning large asymmetries existing between countries themselves. India and like Brazil and Haiti, or India and Chad or other countries. So there is also inequality. And different from that inequality, different interests that arise. Then I already mentioned it, institutional underrepresentation. The Global South lacks proportionate representation in key global governance institutions like UN Security Council, IMF, the World Bank. Then human capital. Many countries in the Global South face challenges in building advanced, equitable education systems that are also important in order to gain, to keep gaining global visibility, global influence. Global Southern countries are still dependent technologically on Northern and Chinese firms for digital infrastructure, software, and data processing. And finally, yes, there is a rise in South-South investments, but the majority of large-scale strategic foreign direct investments still come from developed economies in the West and from China. So there's still a long way to overcome these challenges for the Global South countries. And I want to, to showcase some of these limitations, but also possibilities as potentials. Now, I chose Latin America. Yeah, as you can see here, for example, there are also different views on the future of Latin America, on the future place of Latin America in the global order. For example, some scholars are concerned with the fact that Latin America and Africa might remain, might become an absolute South, meaning countries, economies in a permanent state of development, without being able to make an impact, to influence global development, global order. Or that Latin America will be geopolitically sidelined. Perhaps it's even good for Latin America if you compare it to Ukraine, Middle East, or South China Sea. It's it appears to be good to be geopolitically less important. But what comes with it is that it might attract less attention in terms of, for example, foreign direct investment. But I don't see it that way. And I show you how I see it, how I see potential for Latin America. So various sectors. First, Latin America has a potential to establish itself as a significant economic and political player in this evolving global landscape, particularly with regard to renewable energy, climate policy, critical minerals. By 2030, Latin America and Caribbean expected to have the third largest number of hydrogen projects in the world, and Brazil already produces 7% of the world's renewable energy. Also, Latin America occupies an important place in energy transformation and innovation. For that, critical minerals are essential. Lithium is essential for the production of numerous products ranging from mobile devices to electric cars. And around 60% of the world's lithium reserves are estimated to be concentrated in the so-called lithium triangle on the territories of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. But to establish itself as a significant economic and political player in the global order, I would say that Latin America and Caribbean must diversify its economies beyond natural resource exports and promote industrialization. And to this end, it's necessary to promote the growth of foreign direct investments and introduction of digital technology, so technological advancement. For example, through strategic partnerships with India, with China, with Russia, United States, and European Union. Latin America, also I would say that Latin America could take advantage of the competition between China and the United States, as Costa Rica, for example, doing. Costa Rica is home to Intel's only assembly and testing facility in Latin America, at a time when Washington wants to reduce its dependence from China. And Costa Rica is also a first global strategic partner of Washington under the CHIP Act of 2022. And also with Panama, United States and Panama formed a strategic alliance to strengthen Panama's semiconductor industry. So what I want to say is that Latin America must engage more, it should engage more in the current geopolitical restructuring by promoting its own interest and meeting its needs. And that's a challenge. No, that's an opportunity, but that is also a big challenge for the region, because to achieve it, you need to focus on regional integration. You need to develop a regional, more unified regional voice. And also you need alliances, stable alliances with other middle powers in the global south. And last but not least, what I want to highlight, and I think that it is a big advantage that Latin America has and should preserve and develop further, is the special role of Latin American diplomacy. Because unlike other regions, Latin America has been the scene or the area of peaceful geopolitical competition so far between major powers in a couple of recent decades. And it is a unique feature that distinguishes the region from Eastern Europe, from Africa, Asia, or from Middle East. And I would say that this feature of a peaceful geopolitical competition must be preserved. And it will be a challenge, and it will be an opportunity, and I would say it's a task for Latin American diplomacy for the future. I will leave it here, and we can discuss the rest. Thank you.